Okay, this is the video for the 3.10 lesson, Going to War. In September 1939, Germany's Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler attacked Poland. England and France responded with war declarations, and the Second World War began. The United States, paralyzed by its own economic crisis in the 1930s, hoped to stay out of foreign conflicts. FDR edged the nation towards supporting the Allies, but it took a Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to force America into war. Goals for this lesson: identifies ways in which Franklin Roosevelt assisted the Allies and prepared for war in spite of neutrality legislation. Describe the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. response. Analyze FDR's Four Freedoms speech and its meaning and its relationship to foreign policy. Remember to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key, and then you also have this additional document analysis propaganda posters. Let's begin. Read pages 716 through 722, complete the reading guide, complete the document analysis propaganda poster sheet, and complete the checkpoint. So let's start with page 716. And we're going to start with the United States enters the war. As brutal fascist regimes rose to power in Europe, the United States, preoccupied with its own economic crisis, remained aloof and disengaged. As the Great Depression took hold, American isolationism only deepened. Pennsylvania Governor George Earle spoke for many of his countrymen when he said in 1935, "If the world has become a wilderness of waste, hatred, and bitterness, let us all with the more earnestly protect and preserve our own oasis of liberty." Congress passed 5 neutrality acts between 1935 and 1939, clearly expressing the desire of most Americans to avoid a second world conflict. As the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt likened his European policy to a quarantine in which the diseased patients would be confined and prevented from spreading their illness to the American continent. Nazi escalation. In the summer of 1939, German panzer divisions invaded the Polish countryside, while Hitler's bombers battered the city of Warsaw. When news of Hitler's brazen assault reached FDR, he responded with a sense of foreboding. God help us all. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. The German army overran Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, largely due to Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy, which combined lightning speed and overwhelming firepower. Faced with weak resistance, German forces seized control of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. France fell next, leading British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to lament, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." On July 10, 1940, Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, initiated a series of bombing raids against Britain's coastal defenses. 2 months later, Hitler's planes began to strike at Britain's heart, raining bombs on London's civilian population. In what became known as the Blitz, tens of thousands of British civilians died. As the Battle of Britain raged, Franklin Roosevelt received a steady stream of correspondence from Winston Churchill's mother, who was an American. She urged the president to rally the United States to join the fight against Hitler. Churchill encouraged the British to stand firm and warned, "If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." In mid-1941, Hitler abandoned the non-aggression pact he had signed with Stalin and launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Now the whole of Europe was at war. And here's a picture at the top left, Tower Bridge at right here, amid smoke and fires after German bombing of London during the Blitz. Churchill, never surrender. Let's read this excerpt here at the bottom. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, known for flashing the V for victory sign with his 2 fingers, came to symbolize Britain's defiant resistance. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," he told the British people. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Gives me goosebumps. The arsenal of democracy. In the wake of these developments, the United States slowly abandoned its position of neutrality toward Europe. Though forced by political considerations to focus on the American economy, FDR deeply sympathized with the Allied cause. He understood that while most Americans were sympathetic to the Allies' struggle against Hitler, they even more strongly supported an isolationist policy of strict neutrality as the global conflict escalated. Roosevelt knew that if he moved too quickly in support of the Allies, he risked undermining support for his domestic reforms designed to address the nation's economic problems. FDR began a gradual strategy of engagement by implementing a cash and carry policy that enabled combatants in Europe to purchase supplies from the United States. Buyers had to pay for the supplies in cash and carry them away from American ports in their own ships. Even as the president sought ways to support Britain, isolationists in the United States criticized his cash and carry plan as a step toward war. The Nazis' aerial bombardment of London provided FDR with an opportunity, and he quickly seized it. In nightly broadcasts from London, radio reporter Edward R. Murrow described the destruction of the Blitz, and Roosevelt himself used the airwaves to urge support for Britain. In his December 29, 1940 fireside chat, the president declared, "If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the high seas. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun." The president reassured his listeners that he was not asking to send American troops to Europe. "The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting," he said. "Rather, they ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them." Roosevelt called for business, industry, and government to focus on wartime production. Instead of manufacturing farm implements, cash registers, and automobiles and sewing machines, factories must produce fuses, bomb packing crates, shells, and pistols and tanks. "The United States," said FDR, "must become the great arsenal of democracy." And that's a very famous quote that came out of FDR's presidency, making the United States a great arsenal of democracy. Okay, now I want to go back and read as FDR's Four Freedoms speech. On January 6, 1941, in his State of the Union address delivered to Congress, President Roosevelt began to prepare the American people for the eventuality of war. He said he found it necessary to report that the future and safety of our country and of our democracy are overwhelmingly involved in events far beyond our borders. He urged Congress to provide funding to accelerate the armaments industry and to support loans to the imperial nations. He asked the American people to make sacrifices that the emergency, almost as serious as war, demands. He also identified four core American liberties, four freedoms as he called them, which he claimed are universal human rights: freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. In some ways, the four freedoms represented a bold expansion of Roosevelt's New Deal agenda. By highlighting freedom from fear and freedom from want, FDR argued that people had a basic human right to earn a living wage and live in a stable and secure world. The four freedoms became famous when the popular artist Norman Rockwell painted a series of posters to promote the war effort, featuring scenes that promoted FDR's ambitious vision. In the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third freedom is from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, everywhere in the world. The fourth freedom is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. That is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite base for a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation. That kind of world is the very antithesis of so-called New World Order of tyranny, which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb. To that new order we oppose greater conception, the moral order. A good society is able to face schemes of world domination and foreign revolutions alike without fear. Since the beginning of our American history, we have been engaged in change, in a perpetual peaceful revolution, a revolution which goes on steadily, quietly, adjusting itself to changing conditions, without the concentration camp or the quick lime in the ditch. The world order which we seek is the cooperation of free countries working together in a friendly, civilized society. This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in a freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain these rights or keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose. To that high concept there can be no end save victory. And here's one of those posters made by Norman Rockwell, Save Freedom of Speech, Buy War Bonds, encouraging people to buy war bonds to support the war effort, which will in turn protect the freedom of speech. Lend-Lease and its opponents, continuing on with the lesson reading. Roosevelt proceeded to set up a program he called Lend-Lease, which provided Britain with arms and other supplies it needed to fight the Nazis. In return, Britain gave the United States long-term leases on its military bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the West Indies. In the long run, the Lend-Lease program benefited not only Great Britain, but also the Soviet Union and China. By 1945, the program had doled out close to $50 billion in aid to allies of the United States. Lend-Lease marked a sharp break from the American policy of neutrality, which did not escape the notice of isolationists, who loudly criticized FDR as he ran for a third term as president. The Chicago Tribune, a leading pro-isolationist newspaper, argued that Lend-Lease would draw the United States into another global war and destroy the Republic. Both Roosevelt and his Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, endorsed a selective service bill requiring young American men to complete 1 year of military service. After heated debate, Congress passed the legislation in the fall of 1940, and FDR signed it into law. Though not yet a combatant in the widening world conflict, the United States was preparing for the possibility of war. Roosevelt's drift away from neutrality alarmed isolationists, many of whom gathered under the banner of the American First Committee. America First was a politically diverse group with liberals like Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette Jr. and the labor leader John L. Lewis, as well as conservatives like Joseph P. Kennedy, a prominent baker and the American ambassador to Great Britain from 1937 to 1940, and incidentally, father of future President John F. Kennedy. "England is not fighting our battles," said Kennedy. "This is not our war." Charles Lindbergh, the popular hero of aviation, gave voice to the crude nativism of many in the American First movement when he proclaimed that the three most important groups which have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Though widely criticized as an anti-Semite, Lindbergh continued to rail against the American involvement in the European war, drowning out more thoughtful critics of intervention. When FDR won re-election in an unprecedented third term as president, isolationists complained in a radio broadcast, "When your boy is dying on some battlefield in Europe and he's crying out, 'Mother,' don't blame Franklin Roosevelt because he sent your boy to war. Blame yourself because you sent Franklin Roosevelt back to the White House." But the isolationists, indeed all Americans, would soon be shocked by a blow that could not come from Hitler's forces, but from the Japanese. Pearl Harbor. Like the red sun on its national flag, Japan was on the rise in Asia. By the beginning of World War II, the island country had been industrializing for nearly 70 years. Japanese factories produced steel and textiles, while Japanese shipyards launched ships that sailed for ports around the world. Tokyo, the capital, bustled with 7 million people. Yet Japan's success brought problems. The population was growing, but land was limited. Japan had fewer natural resources than larger countries had. It looked to other Pacific nations for raw materials such as oil, rubber, and metals. Like Europe and the United States, Japan suffered during the Great Depression of the 1930s. With its scant farmland, limited resources, and exploding population, Japan plunged into economic crisis. Some Japanese blamed the West for the country's problems. They preached hatred of democracy, of communism, of capitalism, of all things Western. Japanese military leaders took advantage of widespread public discontent and took control of much of the government. Like the fascists in Europe, Japan's militarists had imperialist ambitions. In 1931, the Japanese army seized Manchuria, a province in northeast China with rich deposits of coal and iron. During the next few years, Japanese forces conquered much of the Chinese coast. In the city of Nanjing, also known as Nanking, Japanese troops raped and slaughtered thousands of civilians in what came to be known as the Rape of Nanking. Japanese military leaders proceeded to transform the nation into a machine for war. They built up the army and the navy. By the time World War II began, Japanese troops occupied Korea, Taiwan, and parts of mainland China. In 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Axis powers. Japan's military leaders had visions of a grand empire that would cover much of Southeast Asia and the islands of the South Pacific. In the middle of that domain lay the Philippine Islands. At this time, the Philippines were an American territory. Thousands of U.S. troops were stationed in military bases on the islands. The Japanese leaders calculated that it was only a matter of time before America entered the war. They decided that their best weapon against the United States was a surprise. 6 huge Japanese aircraft carriers loaded with bombers and escorted by battleships and destroyers set course for Hawaii. Their target was Pearl Harbor, home of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. Sunday, December 7, 1941, began as a peaceful morning at Pearl Harbor. American battleships floated on their moorings. At the airfield, U.S. planes sat on the ground, wingtip to wingtip. Many soldiers and sailors were getting ready for church. I'm going to stop here because this 15 minutes is about up, and we'll start with the next video.